Old Hell's Angel expected a quiet Christmas, until two little girls whispered, "Can we stay?" Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. It was Christmas Eve, a time of warmth, family, and festive cheer. But for Jake Reaper Morrison, a former Hell's Angel with decades of hardened experiences, it was just another lonely evening. The cold air outside was biting, and his small cabin sat silent, save for the flicker of the fire in the hearth. No family, no friends, just him and his memories, some of which he wished he could erase. As he poured himself a drink, the glow from the fireplace cast long shadows on the walls, reminding him of the many nights spent alone, long after his days with the gang had ended. His reputation as a tough, ruthless biker had kept everyone at a distance for years. Most people in town knew better than to approach Jake, and he preferred it that way. He had left behind the life of crime and chaos, but it seemed like the quiet stillness of this new life wasn't any easier. Just as Jake took a sip of his drink, a soft knock on the door broke the silence. It was almost impossible to hear over the howling wind outside. Jake set down his glass and walked toward the door, grumbling about the unexpected interruption. When he opened it, he didn't expect to find two small figures standing on the doorstep. Two little girls, their faces pale from the cold and their clothes tattered, looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. One of the girls, no older than 8, whispered in a shaky voice, "Can we stay?" Jake stood frozen, his instincts telling him to slam the door and retreat to the warmth of his fire. But something in their eyes made him hesitate. They were clearly scared, cold, and desperate for help. He had seen many things in his life: violence, fear, betrayal, but nothing had ever made him feel so torn. The hardened biker in him wanted to shut the door, walk away, and pretend he didn't hear them. But the man beneath the leather, the man who had once cared for others, couldn't ignore their pleas. With a reluctant sigh, Jake stepped aside and let the two girls inside. They immediately huddled near the fire, their small hands trembling. "Thank you," the other girl, slightly older, whispered. Jake just nodded, unsure of what to say. His cabin wasn't much, but it was warm, and it was all he had. He watched the girls, wondering what had led them here. Where were their parents? Why were they out here in the cold alone? He couldn't ask them yet. He knew the silence of the night would reveal more in time. For now, he poured them some hot chocolate, the kind he remembered drinking as a child, and sat across from them, his gaze flickering between their scared faces and the fire that crackled softly. As the minutes passed, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this Christmas would be like no other. The little girls, despite their fragile appearances, carried a burden he couldn't understand yet. They were more than just lost children. They were the key to a story that was about to unfold, one that would change Jake's life forever. The fire crackled in the corner, casting flickering shadows across the room as the two little girls huddled close, their trembling hands wrapped around steaming mugs of hot chocolate. Jake sat across from them, his eyes scanning their faces as he tried to piece together their story. They had shown up on his doorstep, out of the blue, desperate for shelter. He had no idea who they were or where they came from, but something about them felt different. He had lived a long time with a heart hardened by years of fighting and loss. But these girls, these innocent souls, were awakening something he had long buried. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the wind howling outside. Then, the older girl, her face pale and bruised, spoke up in a whisper. "We didn't know where else to go. They were going to take us away." Jake felt a pang of discomfort twist in his gut. Who was she talking about? Who was after them? The younger girl, her face covered in dirt, clutched her sister's sleeve tightly, as if the very act of letting go might mean danger. Jake's instincts kicked in. He had spent decades around men who lived by violence and intimidation. But something about these two girls, something about their fear, was making his old, forgotten instincts rise to the surface. "Who's going to take you away?" Jake asked, his voice rough with the weight of years spent suppressing his emotions. The older girl hesitated, her eyes darting to the door, as if expecting someone to burst through at any moment. Our parents, they told us to run, she said, her voice barely audible. They weren't safe. We don't have anywhere else to go. Jake sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had lived a life full of danger, but this was different. This was real. He looked at the two girls, their eyes wide and filled with fear, and he knew that no matter what had happened before, they needed him now. You're safe here, Jake said, his voice low but firm. No one's going to hurt you while you're under my roof. Not on Christmas. As the night wore on, Jake stayed with them, keeping the conversation light, trying to ease their anxiety with simple questions about their lives. The younger girl, with dark, wide eyes, barely spoke, but her presence was enough to make the room feel a little less empty. He found himself staring at them, wondering what kind of world they had come from, what kind of things they had seen. It wasn't just the cold that had brought them to his door. It was something darker, something that Jake could no longer ignore. The fire in the hearth sputtered, casting a warm glow over the room, and for the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of peace wash over him. It was a strange feeling, almost foreign. He had been a Hell's Angel for so long, living a life built on chaos and the unspoken rules of brotherhood. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was just a man, sitting in front of a fire with two little girls who needed help. The next morning, Jake woke early, the first rays of sunlight barely creeping through the curtains. He stepped outside, taking in the crisp, cold air. The snow had stopped falling, leaving the world outside covered in a blanket of white. As he stood there, breathing in the silence of the morning, his thoughts returned to the girls. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Something wasn't adding up. He had spent years in the streets, dealing with people who lived on the edge of society, and he knew better than to trust everything at face value. What were they running from? Who was after them? As Jake turned to head back inside, he heard the unmistakable sound of a truck pulling up the driveway. His heart skipped a beat as he saw a black pickup roll into view, its headlights cutting through the morning fog. Jake didn't hesitate. He stepped back inside, closing the door quietly behind him. He needed to keep the girls safe. He couldn't let anyone take them from him. Not today. He moved quickly, his mind working on overdrive as he mentally prepared for whatever was about to happen. The knock on the door came a few minutes later, sharp and demanding. Jake's hand moved instinctively to the shotgun on the wall, the weight of it familiar, the cold steel grounding him. He peered through the peephole, his heart pounding in his chest. Two men stood outside, both wearing dark jackets and caps. Their presence sent a chill down Jake's spine. He knew exactly who they were. The kind of men who didn't ask questions, the kind of men who took what they wanted. Jake's fingers tightened around the handle of the shotgun. He wasn't going to let these men take the girls. Not without a fight. But he knew he needed to be careful. The last thing he wanted was for the situation to escalate into something he couldn't control. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. This wasn't his first rodeo. As he opened the door, he met the gaze of the two men, his eyes cold and unwavering. "Can I help you?" Jake's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it that told them he wasn't someone they could easily push around. The men exchanged glances before one of them spoke. "We're looking for two girls," he said, his tone dismissive. "You seen them?" Jake stood his ground, his mind racing as he weighed his options. He couldn't let them in. Not without a reason. Not without knowing more. "No," Jake replied simply. "I haven't seen anyone." The men didn't seem convinced. But they didn't push further. They gave him one last look before turning and walking back to their truck. Jake watched them drive away, the tension in his body easing slightly. But the feeling of unease remained. Something wasn't right. And Jake wasn't about to let his guard down. Not now. Not when the girls were under his roof. Jake sat back down in the chair, his eyes still fixed on the door where the two men had been just moments ago. The sound of the truck fading into the distance did little to calm his racing heart. He knew they would be back. They always came back. It was the kind of life he had lived for too long, a life that never let go. But now, with the girls under his roof, everything felt different. His old instincts kicked in. Protect, survive, fight. But something was telling him that the stakes were higher than they had ever been before. As the fire continued to crackle in the corner of the room, Jake's gaze drifted to the two girls, sitting on the couch, still clutching their mugs of hot chocolate. They looked so small, so fragile, but there was a strength in their eyes that Jake couldn't ignore. It was a strength he hadn't seen in a long time. For a moment, He considered his options. He could drive the girls to the nearest shelter, get them out of town, but then what? He couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was after them would just track them down again. No, he realized, he had to protect them here. He had to make sure they stayed safe, no matter what. The younger girl, the one who had barely spoken since they arrived, shifted in her seat and looked up at Jake. Her eyes were wide, full of fear, and it broke Jake's heart to see her like that. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure if they were going to be okay, but he couldn't tell her that. "You're safe here," he said, his voice steady. "No one's going to hurt you while you're with me." The older girl, who had been a little more vocal, nodded slowly, but there was still a hesitation in her eyes. She didn't seem convinced. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They're after us. They'll come for us. They always do." Jake felt the weight of her words sink into his chest. Whoever was after these girls wasn't going to stop just because they found a safe place. He had known men like that, ruthless, relentless, and unforgiving. But Jake wasn't that man anymore. He wasn't going to let them take these girls, not after everything they had already been through. He stood up abruptly, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit here waiting for the next knock on the door. He went to the window and peered through the curtains, scanning the road outside. Nothing. The snow had started to fall again, and the street was quiet, empty. But Jake knew better than to trust silence. It never lasted. He grabbed his jacket from the back of the chair and slipped it on. "Stay here," he said, turning to the girls. "Lock the door when I leave. Don't open it for anyone but me." The older girl nodded, but the younger one seemed too frightened to move. She grabbed her sister's hand and held on tightly. Jake gave them a reassuring smile before stepping out into the cold. The wind hit him like a slap in the face, but he didn't flinch. He pulled his collar up and started walking down the path toward the road. He needed to find out who these men were and what they wanted with the girls. As he walked, he could feel the weight of the situation settling in. He hadn't been this scared in years. But this wasn't about him. It was about them, the girls, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to them. He made his way to the end of the driveway and stood there for a moment, staring out at the empty road. It was then that he heard it, a faint sound, a car engine. He froze. Slowly, he turned and saw a black SUV creeping down the street, its headlights cutting through the snow like a blade. It wasn't the same truck as before, but Jake didn't need to see the driver's face to know what this was. They were back, and this time, they weren't leaving without a fight. Jake stepped back into the shadows, pressing himself against the side of the house, keeping his eyes on the approaching vehicle. His heart was pounding in his chest as the SUV slowly rolled past. He waited, holding his breath, hoping they wouldn't stop. But then, just as the vehicle reached the end of the road, it screeched to a halt. Jake cursed under his breath. They weren't just looking for the girls, they were looking for him too. He had been a Hell's Angel for most of his life, but he hadn't expected to be dragged back into this world of violence and danger. Not after everything he had done to leave it behind. But now, with the girls in danger, he couldn't walk away. Not again. As the SUV stopped, Jake crouched low, his mind working quickly. He needed to move fast, but he also needed to be smart. He couldn't let them know he was here, not yet. He glanced back at the cabin, his eyes narrowing. Inside, the girls were safe, for now. But they wouldn't be for long if Jake didn't act quickly. The men were getting out of the SUV. One was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark leather jacket. The other was smaller, wiry, with a cold look in his eyes. They were looking for someone, and Jake wasn't going to let them find what they were searching for. He turned and slipped into the woods, moving silently through the snow. His heart was pounding in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had to get to them before they got to him. Jake moved quickly, staying low to the ground as he navigated through the trees. The snow was falling harder now, the soft crunch beneath his boots muffled by the thick layers of fresh snow. His breath came in shallow gasps, visible in the frigid air, but his focus was razor-sharp. He needed to stay hidden, to keep an eye on those men, but he couldn't let them get too close to the girls. The tension in his chest was building, the weight of everything he had left behind, and everything he was trying to protect, pressing down on him. The SUV had stopped at the end of the road, its headlights cutting through the falling snow. The two men had gotten out, scanning the area. The larger of the two was pacing, his steps heavy, while the smaller one stayed close to the vehicle, his eyes darting back and forth as if expecting someone to jump out at them at any moment. Jake's hand instinctively reached for the knife at his belt. He didn't want to fight. He didn't want any of this to escalate, but he knew it was coming. The men were looking for something, and they were determined to find it. Jake took a deep breath, mentally preparing himself for what was about to happen. He had to get the drop on them before they found the cabin. He had to make sure the girls were safe. Moving with careful precision, Jake crept closer, staying behind trees and bushes, using the snow as cover. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained clear. The larger man had moved toward the woods, likely thinking someone might be hiding in the trees. The smaller man was heading back toward the cabin. Jake's eyes narrowed. He had to act quickly. He waited until the larger man was just out of sight, then dashed forward, closing the distance between himself and the SUV. He wasn't sure how many more of them there were, but he didn't have time to worry about that now. His first priority was the girls. When he reached the vehicle, he ducked behind it, holding his breath as he peeked around the side. The smaller man was walking slowly toward the cabin, his eyes scanning the area, but Jake stayed still. He had to be careful. He couldn't let this turn into a confrontation, at least, not yet. He needed to get the upper hand. He watched the man move closer to the cabin, his attention still fixed on the surroundings. The door was unlocked. Jake had left it that way for a reason. He waited, his fingers tightening around the handle of his knife. The moment the man stepped onto the porch, Jake moved. He lunged forward, taking the man down quickly and silently, his hand clamping over his mouth before he could shout. The man struggled, but Jake's grip was strong. "Stay quiet," Jake muttered in the man's ear, his voice cold and commanding. The man's eyes widened, realizing the danger. "What do you want?" the man whispered, but Jake didn't answer. He just moved swiftly, pulling the man off the porch and behind the SUV, keeping his body low and out of sight. Jake's pulse raced as he dragged the man into the snow, making sure he stayed hidden. He wasn't sure how long the larger man would stay away, but he couldn't risk being seen. He tied the smaller man's hands together with a length of rope he'd grabbed from the back of the SUV, ensuring the man couldn't escape. As Jake stood over him, his mind was racing, but his eyes were focused on the task at hand. "You're not going anywhere until I say so," Jake said quietly, his voice cold as steel. The man glared at him, but he didn't make a sound. Jake turned his attention to the cabin. The girls were still inside, waiting, and he had to make sure they stayed safe. He wasn't going to let anything happen to them, not on his watch. As he started to move toward the door, he heard a loud crash. His heart skipped a beat as the larger man emerged from the woods, his voice shouting, "Where is she?" Jake's mind raced. He had to act fast. He couldn't let the larger man find the girls. With a glance back at the tied-up man, Jake made a decision. He moved quickly, grabbing the man's jacket and yanking him to his feet. "Get up," Jake ordered, his voice harsh. "You're going to help me." The man struggled, but Jake wasn't in the mood for a fight. He dragged the man toward the cabin, knowing that every second counted. He needed to get inside, to make sure the girls didn't get caught in the crossfire. The snow was falling harder now, the wind picking up as the storm continued to intensify. Jake's mind was racing, but there was no turning back now. The girls were depending on him. The man in his grip groaned, clearly terrified of what was happening, but Jake didn't care. His focus was on the cabin, on the girls. He had to keep them safe. As they reached the door, Jake threw it open and stepped inside. He could hear the girls talking softly in the other room, and his heart gave a small leap of relief. They were still there. But as he moved toward the kitchen, a sound caught his ear. The larger man had returned. He was closing in on the cabin, and there was no time left. Jake's breath came in short, quick bursts as he prepared for what was to come. He wasn't going to let them take the girls. Not without a fight. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears as he stepped into the cabin, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of the larger man. He could hear the girls whispering in the next room, their voices barely audible above the howling wind outside. He had no idea how much time he had before the bigger man arrived, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't about to let these girls become another casualty of his past. He moved quickly, his feet silent on the wooden floor as he reached the kitchen. The cabin was small, cramped, but it felt like a fortress in this moment. He hadn't planned on it, but here he was, defending two young girls who had no one else to turn to. He had always been alone, fighting battles that no one cared about. But now, with these girls in his life, everything was different. The sound of the front door creaking open broke his concentration. His heart skipped a beat. The larger man had returned. He could hear the crunch of his boots in the snow outside, growing louder with each passing second. The tension in Jake's chest was unbearable. There was no time left to think, to plan. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he moved toward the living room, where the girls were huddled together. He motioned for them to stay quiet. The older girl's eyes were wide with fear, but she nodded, understanding the urgency in his eyes. Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. He had to make sure the girls were safe, but he couldn't let the man find them. The snowstorm outside made everything feel even more isolated, as if the whole world had disappeared into the cold white abyss. The only sound was the storm's howl and the frantic beating of Jake's heart. He could feel his muscles tense, ready for whatever was coming. He knew that if he wasn't careful, the situation would spiral out of control. He couldn't let the man take them, not without a fight. The door creaked open wider, and Jake heard the heavy footsteps of the man on the porch. He knew it was only a matter of seconds before the man stepped inside. He had to act now. With a swift motion, Jake grabbed the shotgun from behind the door and aimed it toward the entrance. The man was close, and there was no way out. This was it. The door slammed open, and the larger man stepped inside, his heavy boots leaving tracks in the snow as he crossed the threshold. His eyes locked onto Jake, and for a moment, neither of them moved. The man's eyes narrowed, and a grin spread across his face. "You thought you could hide from us, didn't you?" he sneered, taking a step forward. Jake's grip tightened on the shotgun, his finger brushing the trigger. "Stay back," Jake warned, his voice low and dangerous. "You're not taking them." The man laughed, the sound cold and empty. "You think you can stop me? I'm not the one you need to worry about." Jake didn't flinch. "I'm not going to let you hurt them," he said firmly. The man's expression shifted, his grin disappearing. For a moment, Jake thought he might back off. But then, without warning, the man lunged forward, his hand reaching for the shotgun. In a split second, Jake reacted, pushing the barrel of the shotgun against the man's chest and pulling the trigger. The blast echoed through the cabin, sending a shockwave of force through Jake's body. The man stumbled back, crashing into the doorframe with a loud thud. Jake didn't give him a chance to recover. He moved quickly, disarming the man and knocking him to the ground. The larger man grunted, trying to push himself up, but Jake was already on top of him, pinning him down. "You don't get to hurt anyone else," Jake growled, his voice filled with raw anger. The man's eyes widened, realizing the depth of the situation. He tried to fight back, but Jake's grip was too strong. "You're not going anywhere," Jake said, his voice cold as ice. The man struggled beneath him, but Jake didn't let go. He had to make sure the girls were safe, and he wouldn't let anyone threaten that. After a moment, Jake stood up, looking down at the man. He was still breathing, but he wasn't getting up anytime soon. Jake grabbed a length of rope from the corner of the room and tied the man's hands behind his back. He wasn't taking any chances. The man wasn't going anywhere. As Jake finished securing the man, he heard the sound of the front door opening again. His heart stopped. He wasn't ready for this. There was someone else out there. Jake turned toward the door, his mind racing. He didn't know how many more of them were out there, but he had to act fast. With the man tied up and the girls in the other room, Jake had only one option left. He had to protect them, no matter what. He grabbed the shotgun again, his fingers tightening around the cold metal. The storm outside raged on, but Jake was ready. This time, he wasn't going to run. The cold wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, but inside the cabin, a tense silence had settled. Jake stood at the door, gripping his shotgun tightly, every nerve in his body on edge. The man he had subdued was still tied up in the corner, groaning occasionally, but Jake barely spared him a glance. His focus was entirely on the next threat. He had to protect the girls, no matter what it took. His heart raced, not just from the physical confrontation, but from the weight of the responsibility he felt. These girls had nobody else. They were counting on him. Jake's eyes darted to the girls, who were sitting in the living room, eyes wide with fear. They had been through so much already, and now they were caught in the middle of a storm that Jake couldn't have predicted. They didn't deserve any of this. The older girl, the one who had spoken the most since they arrived, glanced at Jake and nodded, as if to say she understood the danger. The younger one, still clutching her sister's arm, looked terrified. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, but there was something else too. Something that spoke to the strength she was trying to hide. As Jake continued to scan the room, his instincts screaming that something was off, he heard it. A sound outside the door. Footsteps, faint at first, but growing louder. They were getting closer. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. They were coming for him, coming for the girls. Jake moved quickly, stepping away from the door and taking up a defensive position behind the kitchen island. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained clear. He couldn't let them get to the girls. Not now. The door creaked open, and the larger man from earlier stepped. Inside, his eyes scanning the room. Jake's grip tightened on the shotgun, but he stayed hidden. He wasn't about to give himself away until the moment was right. The man entered fully, his heavy boots thudding against the floor, and paused as if sensing something was wrong. He didn't see Jake at first. He was too busy looking around, trying to make sense of the quiet. Jake's muscles tensed as he waited for the perfect moment. The man turned slightly, his back now to Jake, giving him the opening he needed. With swift precision, Jake lunged forward, his hand on the shotgun, and pointed it directly at the man's back. "Move," Jake growled, his voice cold and firm. The man froze, a look of disbelief crossing his face as he turned to face Jake. "You think you can stop me?" the man sneered, his eyes narrowing. "You've already made a mistake." Jake didn't respond. He didn't have to. He knew the man had underestimated him. He wasn't just some washed-up biker. He wasn't the same person he had been all those years ago. He was ready to fight for these girls, to protect them no matter the cost. The man stepped forward, clearly intent on making this a confrontation, but Jake was faster. He slammed the shotgun against the man's chest, forcing him back against the door. The larger man grunted, but Jake kept the pressure on. "Not another step," Jake warned, his voice low and dangerous. The man was visibly struggling to regain control, but Jake wasn't giving him the chance. He kept the shotgun aimed at his chest, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. The tension in the room was palpable, every second stretching out as the man glared at him. Jake could feel his pulse hammering in his ears, but his focus remained unwavering. He wasn't going to let anything happen to these girls. The man, realizing that Jake wasn't going to back down, gave a reluctant nod. "All right," the man muttered, his hands slowly rising in surrender. "You win. For now." But Jake didn't lower the gun. He wasn't convinced. "I'm not letting you off that easily," Jake said, his eyes never leaving the man's face. He took a step forward, keeping the shotgun trained on the man's chest. "You'll leave now, or I'll make sure you don't come back." The larger man stared at Jake for a long moment, the silence hanging heavy between them. Then, with a sharp exhale, the man took a step back, his hands lowering slowly. "This isn't over," the man said quietly, his voice laced with menace. "You'll regret this." Jake's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. He simply stepped aside, watching as the man turned and walked toward the door. As the door closed behind him, Jake let out a slow breath, his muscles still tense. He had won this round, but he knew it wasn't over. The larger man would be back, and Jake would be ready. But for now, the girls were safe. That was all that mattered. Jake turned to the girls, who had been watching the entire confrontation in silence. The older girl was the first to speak, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her eyes meeting Jake's. "We didn't think anyone would help us." Jake gave a small nod, his expression softening slightly. "You're safe here," he said, his voice firm but kind. "As long as you need me, I'll protect you." The younger girl, still clutching her sister's hand, looked up at Jake, her eyes filled with a mix of awe and fear. "Will they come back?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake didn't want to lie to her. He knew the answer. "They'll be back," he said, his voice steady. "But we'll be ready for them." For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of peace settle over him. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was ready to face it. For the first time in years, he had a reason to fight, and he wasn't going to let anything happen to the girls. The wind outside had picked up, the storm now raging as if the very heavens were trying to bury the world beneath a blanket of snow. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. Jake stood at the window, his eyes narrowed as he watched the swirling storm, the distant sound of the wind almost a reminder of the chaos that had just unfolded. The larger man had left for now, but Jake knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He turned to the two girls sitting quietly on the couch, their faces still pale from fear, their eyes wide with unease. They were safe for the moment, but Jake knew they couldn't stay here forever. The storm was no longer the biggest threat. He could feel the weight of responsibility settle deeper within him. These girls had no one else. He was all they had now. The younger girl, the one who hadn't spoken much, finally looked up at Jake, her voice trembling. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Jake's gaze softened as he approached them, trying to offer a semblance of calm. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing he did know was that he wasn't going to let anything happen to them. He wasn't going to let them fall through the cracks like so many people had let him do all those years ago. "We're going to be okay," Jake said, his voice firm. "But we need to move. The people after you, after us, they won't stop. We need to get somewhere safe." The older girl nodded, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. But there was still a question there, lingering between them. "Where do we go?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake didn't have an answer to that. He had a few connections, but those were in the past, and he didn't know who he could trust anymore. He had cut ties with everyone. He had left that life behind. But now, with these girls in danger, everything had changed. "I'll figure something out," Jake said, his voice more to reassure himself than anything else. He turned back to the door, the weight of his decision settling deeper into his chest. He could feel the familiar tug of his old instincts, the same ones that had kept him alive in the brutal world of the Hells Angels, but now they were sharper, more focused. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about protecting these girls. He couldn't fail them. As Jake stood there, lost in thought, he heard the unmistakable sound of a car approaching. He froze, his heart racing. They were back, the men from before. This time, Jake wasn't going to wait for them to make the first move. He grabbed the shotgun once more, feeling the cold weight of it in his hands. He moved toward the back of the cabin, making sure to stay out of sight. His thoughts raced as he prepared for the worst. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. Not this time. He peeked out from behind the cabin, watching as the black SUV pulled up once again. The same two men stepped out, but this time, there was a third figure with them, someone Jake hadn't seen before. The new guy was tall, broad-shouldered, and his movements were deliberate, like someone who had done this 100 times before. Jake's mind was working fast. They were getting more serious. They were bringing in reinforcements. Jake didn't have time to waste. He needed to think of a way out of this. But before he could move, the younger girl's voice echoed from the cabin. "Jake, they're here," she whispered. Jake's heart sank. He hadn't wanted them to hear, but he knew it was inevitable. He had to act now. He turned to the girls, who had silently moved into the corner of the room, their eyes wide with fear. "Stay here, and stay quiet," Jake ordered, his voice low but commanding. "I'll handle this." He wasn't sure how, but he knew he had to keep them safe. He couldn't afford to let them see how vulnerable they really were. He had made his choice. He was going to fight. The three men approached the front door, their boots crunching on the snow, the sound muffled by the storm. Jake's hand tightened on the shotgun, his heart pounding. He couldn't let them inside. He couldn't let them find the girls. He crouched low, staying hidden behind the cabin as the men came closer, their voices drifting on the wind. "We know they're in there," one of them said. It was the smaller man, his voice filled with an edge of frustration. "We're not leaving without them." Jake's grip tightened even further. He wasn't about to let them take the girls. He had nothing left to lose. The storm raged on around them, but Jake's focus remained sharp. The men were getting closer. The time for stealth was running out. He took a deep breath, prepared to do whatever it took. He couldn't let these girls fall into the hands of men like them. This time, Jake wasn't going to let them walk away. He was going to stop them. The sound of boots crunching in the snow grew louder as Jake crouched behind the cabin, his pulse pounding in his ears. The wind howled through the trees, the storm still raging outside, but all he could hear now was the sound of the men approaching. His grip on the shotgun tightened, his body tensed, ready for what was coming. This was it. He couldn't let them get any closer. He couldn't let them find the girls. The larger man led the way, his bulky form moving with a sense of purpose. The smaller man was close behind, his eyes darting around, looking for any sign of movement. Jake's mind raced as he watched them approach, calculating his next move. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. As the men reached the front door of the cabin, Jake made his decision. He needed to distract them, throw them off balance, and give himself a chance to act. With a quick motion, he grabbed a large rock from the ground and threw it across the yard, the sound echoing through the trees. The men stopped in their tracks, turning toward the noise. For a split second, Jake saw their confusion, just enough time for him to move. He dashed forward, his boots silent on the snow as he approached the larger man from behind. He aimed for the man's back, using the element of surprise to his advantage. In one swift motion, Jake slammed the barrel of the shotgun against the man's back, forcing him to the ground with a grunt. The smaller man spun around, his eyes wide with shock, but Jake was already on him. He tackled the man to the ground, using his weight to pin him down. The shotgun was still in his hands, but it was useless at this close range. Jake slammed the butt of the gun against the smaller man's stomach, knocking the wind out of him. The man gasped for air, but Jake didn't give him a chance to recover. He grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground. "Stay down," Jake growled, his voice low and menacing. The smaller man struggled, but Jake's grip was unrelenting. He wasn't about to let him get away. As Jake held the man down, he glanced up at the cabin. The girls were still inside, and the older girl had her eyes glued to the window, watching the confrontation. Jake's heart clenched at the sight of her. He had promised to protect them, and he wasn't about to break that promise. He had to finish this. He could hear the larger man groaning behind him, trying to push himself up. Jake didn't hesitate. He kicked the man in the chest, sending him sprawling back into the snow. "Stay down," I said. Jake barked, his voice sharp. The larger man didn't argue. He stayed down, breathing heavily, but there was a look of pure rage in his eyes. Jake knew they weren't done yet. These men weren't just going to give up. He had to end this quickly. He looked down at the smaller man, who was still gasping for breath, his face pale from the shock. Jake's grip on the man's wrist tightened as he moved to stand up. "You're not going anywhere," Jake warned, his voice cold and deadly. The smaller man didn't respond. He just glared at Jake, his body trembling. The larger man, still on the ground, managed to push himself to his knees. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. Jake could see it in his eyes. "You don't know who you're messing with," the larger man spat, his voice filled with venom. Jake didn't flinch. "I know exactly who I'm messing with," he said, his voice calm but full of conviction. "And I'm not going to let you hurt anyone else." He turned back to the smaller man, who was still trying to break free, but Jake had already secured him. He wasn't going anywhere. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the cabin, it was silent except for the sound of Jake's breathing. The larger man continued to glare at him, his anger obvious, but Jake wasn't intimidated. He had made his choice. He was going to protect the girls, no matter the cost. He wasn't going to let these men get away with what they had done. As Jake stood over them, his eyes scanning the two men on the ground, he knew the fight wasn't over. They might be down for now, but they wouldn't stay down for long. And when they came back, he would be ready. But for now, the girls were safe. For now, he had won. The girls needed him. They needed to get out of there before anyone else showed up. Jake glanced back at the cabin, then at the two men at his feet. He wasn't about to give them a chance to regroup. He needed to move fast. He stood up, moving toward the cabin door, and glanced over his shoulder. The storm was still fierce, the snow falling in thick, heavy flakes. But Jake didn't care. He wasn't afraid of the storm. He had already faced worse. He stepped inside, where the girls were waiting, their eyes wide with fear and hope. "We're leaving," Jake said, his voice steady and calm. The older girl nodded, her face filled with gratitude. She had seen the danger outside, and now she was ready to leave it behind. Jake turned to the younger girl, who was still holding her sister's hand. "You're safe now," he said softly, giving her a reassuring smile. But inside, Jake's mind was already working. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The fight was far from over. Jake could feel the weight of the moment as he glanced at the two girls standing quietly in the doorway of the cabin. The storm outside had intensified, the wind howling as if it was trying to tear the world apart. But inside, it was strangely calm. For the first time in a long while, Jake wasn't thinking about his past, his regrets, or his mistakes. He was thinking about them, the girls. They were the only thing that mattered now. The older girl's eyes met his, filled with an unspoken question. She wanted to know what came next, what they were going to do, but Jake didn't have all the answers. He had no plan. All he knew was that they couldn't stay here. The men who had come after them weren't going to give up. They would be back, and Jake wasn't about to risk the girls' lives again. He looked over at the larger man, still lying on the ground, tied up and groaning, his eyes filled with hatred. Jake knew they couldn't leave him alive. As much as he hated the thought, it was the only way to ensure their safety. The larger man had made it clear that he would never stop, that he would come after them as soon as he had the chance. Jake turned back to the girls, trying to offer a reassuring smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "We need to go," Jake said softly, his voice steady. "But we're not safe here. We have to keep moving." The older girl nodded, her expression a mix of fear and resolve. She understood the gravity of the situation. The younger girl, who had been silent for most of the night, finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Where will we go?" she asked, looking up at Jake with wide, trusting eyes. Jake hesitated. He didn't have a destination in mind. He had no plan, no safe house, no place to take them. All he had was a bike, a cabin, and the cold, empty road ahead. But he couldn't leave them to fend for themselves. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, his voice more confident than he felt. "I know some people. We'll find a place. But we have to move fast." The older girl nodded again, glancing at her younger sister, who was holding tightly to her side. Jake could see the fear in her eyes, but also a flicker of something else. Hope. Maybe, just maybe, Jake could be the one to give them that hope. As Jake moved toward the door, he glanced one last time at the men lying on the ground. The larger one was still out cold, but the smaller man had regained some of his composure. His eyes were filled with venom, but Jake wasn't worried. He had them tied up, and he wasn't about to let them get in the way. He had bigger problems to deal with. "Come on," Jake said, stepping outside into the howling storm. The snow was coming down harder now, and the wind whipped through the trees, making it hard to see. But Jake wasn't concerned with the storm. He was focused on the road ahead. He had to get the girls out of there before anyone else came looking for them. He moved quickly, making sure the girls were close behind him. He didn't look back at the cabin. There was no time for that. The danger was still out there, and Jake knew they had to keep moving. The storm made it harder to hear, but Jake's senses were sharp, his training kicking in as he kept a close watch on the road ahead. They didn't speak much as they made their way toward the bike. The older girl kept her arm protectively around her younger sister, who was still shaken but seemed to be holding it together. Jake's heart went out to them. They didn't deserve any of this, but he wasn't going to let them down. Not on his watch. He reached the bike, pulling his jacket tighter around him as the wind tried to tear it from his shoulders. He made sure the girls were settled before strapping on his helmet. As he revved the engine, the sound of the bike cutting through the storm was a relief. They were leaving the danger behind. But Jake knew that peace would only be temporary. The men would be back, and the girls would need more than just a bike ride. They would need a plan. Jake kicked the bike into gear, speeding off into the night, the road stretching out before him like a never-ending trail. He couldn't afford to stop. Not until they were out of harm's way. The snow continued to fall, thick and heavy, but Jake's focus never wavered. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, his mind racing as he thought about what came next. He had no idea where they were going, but he couldn't afford to worry about that. Not now. The girls were counting on him, and Jake wasn't going to let them down. The roar of the motorcycle's engine was the only sound that pierced through the thick snowstorm as Jake sped down the deserted highway. His grip on the handlebars was firm, his eyes focused on the road ahead. The night was dark, the road almost impossible to see through the swirling snow. But Jake had been on roads like this before. He had driven through worse. The girls were behind him, holding tightly to the sides of the bike, their breaths visible in the cold air. They didn't speak much, their silence only broken by the occasional gasp of the younger girl, whose fear still lingered in her eyes. Jake could feel the weight of their presence, the responsibility that now rested on him. He had never imagined his life would come to this. He had always been a lone wolf, a man who fought for himself and nobody else. But now, with these two girls in tow, everything had changed. He couldn't run anymore. Not from his past, not from the people after them, and certainly not from the responsibility he had taken on. The road stretched out ahead, a never-ending ribbon of darkness, but Jake didn't stop. Not until he had put miles between them and the danger they had left behind. As they rode, Jake kept his focus sharp. He knew they couldn't stay on the move forever. The storm would only get worse, and they couldn't risk being caught out in the open with nowhere to go. He needed to find a place, a safe place. But where? The idea of going to anyone he knew felt impossible. Too many old enemies, too many ghosts from the past. No, they couldn't go back to the people Jake used to trust. That life was gone, buried along with his old self. But there had to be someone, somewhere, that could help. Jake's mind raced, running through every option, every possibility. His eyes scanned the horizon, but all he saw was the unbroken wall of snow, stretching endlessly into the night. Hold on tight, Jake called back to the girls. He could barely hear his own voice over the roar of the wind and the engine, but he needed to make sure they were still with him, still safe. He glanced over his shoulder briefly to see the older girl gripping her sister tightly, her face pale but determined. The younger girl still looked terrified, her eyes wide as she clung to her sister's side, but she didn't cry. That was something Jake thought. She was tough. The storm was starting to take its toll on the bike. The wind howled louder, and the snow thickened, making it harder to see even a few feet in front of them. The road had turned into a blinding white void. Jake squinted, trying to make out any sign of a town or shelter ahead. But there was nothing. The highway stretched on, empty, as far as he could see. His chest tightened, the weight of the situation settling in. They couldn't keep driving like this. He needed to find shelter, or they'd freeze long before they were safe. As if on cue, a faint light appeared in the distance. Jake squinted, his heart racing. It wasn't much, but it was something. A house. A small building, maybe a gas station or a diner, but it was a place to stop. He twisted the throttle harder, speeding up toward the light, praying it wasn't another mirage. The snow was thickening, the visibility so low it felt like driving through a wall of cotton. The light flickered in the distance, and for a moment, Jake wasn't sure if it was real. But as they got closer, the outline of a small building began to take shape, and Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't much, but it was a chance. He could see a small sign, barely illuminated, reading "Welcome In." It was a rundown place, a two-story structure that looked like it had seen better days, but it would do. Jake pulled up to the door and cut the engine. The snow had piled up against the door, but with a little effort, Jake managed to push it open. The warmth inside hit him like a wave, and for a moment, he just stood there, letting the heat seep into his bones. The girls were still on the bike, hesitant to get off. Jake turned to them. "Come on," he said softly, offering a hand to help them off the bike. The older girl nodded, taking his hand, while the younger girl hesitated for a moment before following. Inside the small inn, the air smelled of old wood and stale coffee, but it was warm. It was enough. Jake's eyes scanned the room, looking for any sign of danger. There was no one around, and the place seemed abandoned. The last thing Jake needed was more trouble. But for now, they were safe. He could feel the tension in his shoulders ease just a little. "We'll stay here for the night," Jake said, his voice low. "Tomorrow, we figure out the next step." The older girl nodded, her eyes tired but grateful. She glanced at her sister, who was finally starting to relax, though she was still clutching her tightly. Jake didn't blame her. He was tired too. They had all been through too much. "Thank you," the older girl said softly, her voice shaky. "We wouldn't have made it without you." Jake just nodded, not knowing what to say. He wasn't used to gratitude, especially not from people he barely knew. But in that moment, standing in that rundown inn with the girls by his side, Jake realized something. He wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in years, that thought didn't scare him. The dim light from the old lamp flickered as Jake sat down at one of the rickety tables in the corner of the inn. The warmth from the heater was a welcome relief after the freezing ride, but it didn't ease the weight on his shoulders. He had managed to get them out of immediate danger, but the storm still raged outside, and the real danger was far from over. The girls were asleep now, curled up together on one of the old sofas in the corner of the room. They had barely spoken since they had arrived, but Jake could see the exhaustion in their faces. They had been through too much. They needed rest, just like he did. Jake had always been a loner, a man who dealt with his problems on his own. But now, with the girls depending on him, everything had changed. He couldn't afford to make mistakes. He couldn't afford to fail them. As Jake sat there, his mind kept racing. The larger man, the one who had been leading the search for the girls, would be back. He knew it. And the fact that the smaller man was still alive meant that the threat was far from over. Jake had to keep them moving, keep them safe. But where could they go? His old life was gone. The people he used to rely on were either dead or disappeared. He couldn't trust anyone anymore. He thought about the connections he had, the people he could have called for help, but they all came with risks. Old debts, old enemies. It was too dangerous. The best thing for them was to keep moving, keep off the radar. Jake glanced over at the girls, his heart heavy. The older girl had finally fallen asleep, her head resting against the back of the couch. The younger girl was still awake, her eyes wide and alert. She was scared. Jake could see it in the way she clutched her sister's arm, as if she feared that if she let go, the danger would find them again. Jake didn't blame her. He was scared too, but he couldn't let that fear show. He had to be strong for them. He stood up and moved toward the small window at the front of the inn, peering out into the storm. The snow had slowed a little, but it was still thick, swirling in every direction. He couldn't see anything beyond a few yards, but he knew the road outside was empty. The storm had driven everyone inside. For now, they were safe. But Jake knew it wouldn't last. The men would be back, and when they were, Jake had to be ready. He wasn't sure what they would do next, but he knew they couldn't stay here long. The longer they stayed, the more likely it was that someone would find them. He needed a plan. Jake didn't want to take the girls back to the city. It was too dangerous. He had burned too many bridges, and too many people knew who he was. He couldn't risk bringing them into that world. But there had to be a place, somewhere, that they could hide. Maybe there was a small town, a place where people didn't ask too many questions. Jake had heard rumors of places like that, places where people like him could disappear. The problem was finding them. And even if he did, would it be enough to keep the girls safe? Jake sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He was tired, mentally and physically drained. The past few days had been a blur of action, of moving, of running, and he hadn't had time to process any of it. He hadn't had time to think. But as he looked at the girls, he knew he couldn't stop now. He had to keep going. He had to protect them. The storm was still raging outside, but inside the inn, it felt like the calm before the storm. Jake couldn't help but think about everything that had happened, the choices he had made, the people he had left behind, the man he had become. He had never wanted this life, never asked for any of it, but somehow it had become his. And now, with the girls in his care, he realized something that had never fully clicked before. He wasn't just protecting them. He was protecting himself. He was protecting the part of him that still cared, still had a heart. He had spent so many years buried in the world of violence and revenge, but now, with the girls, he saw a chance for something different. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope. The younger girl stirred slightly, her eyes flickering open as she looked up at Jake. For a moment, their eyes met, and Jake could see the question in her gaze. Was it safe? Would they be okay? Jake nodded slightly, his expression softening. "We're safe here, for now," he said, though his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. He wasn't sure if it was true, but it was the only answer he had. The girl gave him a small nod before she closed her eyes again, her body relaxing into her sister's warmth. Jake watched them for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of the world. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let anything happen to them. He would fight until his last breath to keep them safe. The morning after the storm was a quiet, somber affair. The snow had finally stopped falling, and the sky above was a pale blue, tinged with gray clouds that promised more storms to come. Jake stood outside the inn, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets as he stared at the road ahead. The wind had picked up again, but it was nothing compared to the fury of the previous night. The world felt still, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Inside, the girls were still sleeping, exhausted from the fear and chaos of the past few days. Jake didn't blame them. He was tired too, but he couldn't rest. Not yet. Not while the threat still loomed. He had to keep moving, keep them safe. The larger man would be back, and Jake had no illusions about what would happen if they got caught in the open. He had to figure out a plan. He had to find somewhere to go, somewhere that wasn't tainted by the people he used to know. He couldn't bring them into that world. His old life was too dangerous. As Jake stood there, lost in thought, he felt the familiar weight of the shotgun strapped to his back. It was a constant reminder of the violence he had lived through, the violence he had left behind. But now, With the girls depending on him, it felt like a necessary evil. They couldn't afford to be caught unprepared. He had to protect them. Turning back toward the inn, Jake opened the door quietly and stepped inside. The girls were still asleep, curled up together on the couch, their faces peaceful for the moment. Jake's heart clenched as he looked at them. He knew the danger they were in, and it made everything inside him burn with a fierce protectiveness. They had no one else. They were alone, and Jake couldn't let them face that kind of world again. He moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to see the road. There was nothing, just the stretch of snow-covered highway, empty and desolate. But he knew better than to trust the quiet. The danger wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He had to get them moving. He couldn't afford to stay here for long. The longer they stayed, the more likely it was that someone would come looking for them. Jake sighed and ran a hand over his face. He had no clear plan, no safe place to go. But he knew he couldn't keep running forever. They needed somewhere to hide, somewhere the world wouldn't find them. A place to start over. His mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan, any plan. But the weight of the girls' lives, their safety, pressed heavily on his chest. Every decision mattered now. We have to leave soon, Jake muttered to himself. He couldn't stay here forever. He needed to keep them moving, keep them safe. The inn wasn't going to protect them. It was only a temporary refuge. He had to get them to a place where they could rebuild, where they could find peace, even if it was only for a little while. As he turned to leave the room, he heard the soft rustling of the younger girl waking up. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Her face was still pale from the exhaustion, but there was something in her expression that made Jake's heart ache. She was scared, and yet, there was a quiet strength in her that he hadn't seen before. "Are we leaving soon?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with the same determination he had seen in her sister. Jake smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We're leaving soon." She nodded, her gaze flickering toward her sister, who was still fast asleep. Jake's eyes softened as he watched the two of them. They had been through so much, and yet, here they were, still holding on, still fighting. They were tougher than he had ever imagined. The older girl stirred on the couch, blinking sleepily before. Sitting up, she stretched, then looked over at Jake. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice steady but with a hint of worry. Jake hesitated for a moment, then walked over to where they sat. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice low. "The storm's over, but the danger's still out there. We can't stay here." The older girl looked at him, then nodded. "Where do we go?" she asked, her eyes searching his face for answers. Jake didn't have one. Not yet. But he wasn't going to let them down. "We'll figure it out," he said, though his words didn't feel as certain as he wished they did. He wasn't sure what came next. He didn't know where they were going or how they would get there. But he knew one thing for sure. They couldn't stay here. The larger man would be back, and Jake wouldn't let him find them. The older girl stood up, her hand taking her sister's, and for a moment, Jake just watched them. They were scared, but they were resilient. They weren't giving up, and neither was he. He turned toward the door, pulling his jacket tighter around his shoulders. "Let's go," he said, his voice low. The world outside was still cold and unforgiving, but with the girls by his side, Jake was ready to face it. They weren't alone anymore. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. The road stretched before them, a winding path through the snow-covered forest. The sun had begun to rise, casting a pale light over the desolate landscape, the storm finally subsiding. Jake kept his eyes fixed on the road, his mind still racing with the decisions he'd made. His hand gripped the handlebars of the motorcycle tightly, his muscles sore from the ride, but there was no time to rest. The girls were behind him, still and silent, their presence a constant reminder of the responsibility he now carried. He had promised to protect them, and he wasn't going to break that promise. They had driven through the night, the only light coming from the bike's headlamp cutting through the darkness and the snow. They had stopped at the edge of a small town, a place that seemed safe for now. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He had found a quiet little cabin to take shelter in, far enough from the main road that they wouldn't be easily found. He knew the larger man, and the others, would keep searching, but Jake was ready for them. The thought of running, of continuing to hide, felt suffocating. There had to be a way forward. There had to be a place for them to be free of the fear that had followed them for so long. Jake wasn't sure where that place was, but he was determined to find it. The girls had to have a chance. He couldn't promise them safety, but he could give them a fighting chance. The older girl looked up from the bike, her eyes tired but determined. She had been through more than most adults could handle, but there was something in her that refused to break. Jake admired that. "Are we going to stay here?" she asked softly, the uncertainty in her voice clear. Jake turned to look at her, his face grim. "Not here," he said, his voice low but firm. "We can't stay in one place for too long. But we'll figure it out. I'll make sure you're safe." The girl nodded, though Jake could see the fear in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of being caught, not anymore. It was the fear of the unknown. She wanted to believe Jake, wanted to trust that things could get better, but she knew the reality of their situation. The younger girl, still holding her sister's hand, looked at Jake with wide, trusting eyes. She didn't say anything, but Jake could see the hope in her gaze. She had seen the worst of the world already, but she still held on to that hope. He wasn't about to let her down. He wouldn't let either of them down. The night had been long, the ride even longer, but they had made it this far. They had survived. Now, they needed a plan, a future. And Jake was going to make sure they had it. He helped the girls off the bike, guiding them into the cabin where they would rest for the night. The cabin was small but warm, the fire crackling in the stone hearth. It wasn't home, but it was safe. And for now, that was all that mattered. The girls sat on the worn couch, looking out the window at the empty, snow-covered field. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting. But Jake knew better than to trust the quiet. There would be more danger, more threats. But there would also be hope. He wasn't alone anymore. He had a purpose now, and for the first time in years, he wasn't running from his past. He wasn't running from himself. He was standing still, fighting for something worth protecting. The road ahead wasn't clear, but it didn't matter. They had each other, and that was enough. The younger girl finally spoke, her voice small but full of the kind of strength Jake hadn't expected. "Will we be okay?" she asked, her eyes looking up at Jake. Jake kneeled down beside her, his expression softening as he looked at the two of them. "We will be," he said, his voice filled with more certainty than he felt. "As long as we stick together, we'll be okay." The older girl, her eyes weary but filled with gratitude, looked at him and nodded. "Thank you," she whispered. Jake's heart tightened at the words, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence between them felt like an unspoken promise, an understanding that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Jake stood up, walking over to the window, his eyes scanning the horizon. There were still many miles to go, many dangers to face. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. He had a new reason to fight, and he would fight for them. The road was long and uncertain, but Jake knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let these girls down. They were his family now, and he would protect them, no matter the cost.